Good afternoon, buona tarda, buenas tardes. Happy holidays to everyone. Notice I said holidays, I didn't say Christmas. I want to let you know that this is the second research forum of the academic year, but it's the last one of 2024, for those of you who think there's another one coming up. And I will make this reminder only one more time, and it's please encourage your master students to come to the research forums and give them some extra credit for doing so. Okay, we have them sometimes, and they ask questions and they participate, and that's really nice. And it's nice to have them on top of the PhD students and the faculty. So thank you for encouraging them to come when the seminar, of course, is relevant. You think it's relevant to them. I make my students come to all of them if they want to when I teach in the winter. Okay, so having said that, we have our own in-house speaker, Milena. As you know, the assistant professors are invited to be part of the research forum. Sometimes we have so many new assistant professors, which is great news for the department, that we cannot invite them all the first year. So Milena could not present last year, but she's presenting this year. Those of you who are first year, you are coming next year. Okay, so keep that in mind. And Professor Toni Rodon will be the introductions. So thank you very much.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Or afternoon, whatever. Pleasure to host Milena. We're absolutely delighted to have her here today for the last research forum of the natural year, not of the academic year, because we're going to resume them next year. I mean, there are many good things to say about Milena that I could be here for 40 minutes, but you're here to listen to her, not to me. I remember when I met Milena that in person, we started talking about how to clean data in a good way. And I thought, well, she's very cool. Yeah, now I like her. Yeah. And the other interesting thing about her is that she loves tacos for breakfast. Yeah. So if you need advice, please contact her. On a more serious note, Milena is a great researcher, and she's already made very important and substantive contributions to her field, but also to our department, a very active member. And we are very pleased to have her with us. As Veronica mentioned before, she's an assistant professor with us, and essentially her field of study is the political economy of development, a topic that is, the topic that she's going to be talking about today. She has done a lot of interesting things, many of them related to corruption, accountability, relationship with the police, and things that are very topical nowadays. So I'm sure we'll have a very interesting talk in the next minutes. So without further ado, we're here to listen to this talk: Prosecution, Control, and Accountability in Backsliding Democracies. Milena, I'll let you know when you reach 40 minutes. The floor is yours.
There it is. Thank you. Thank you so much. And good afternoon to everyone. And thanks to Toni for that introduction. And to Veronica for inviting me, and also to Sandra for all her work in making all of this possible. And obviously to all of you, I know that this is kind of like the last stretch, and we're all really looking forward to the break. So I really appreciate you taking the time to come listen to me talk about prosecution, control, and accountability in backsliding democracies. So this is part of a project that I am kind of like seeing if it can reach article length. But if not, it's going to have to be thought of as, a different sort of project, perhaps a book project. But let me begin basically by jumping into two cases that are going to highlight the kind of phenomenon that I seek to explain and that I'm going to be talking about today. So in this slide, you can see two pictures of two Mexican governors. So on the left, we have Luis Armando Reynoso Femat, who was governor of Aguascalientes. And on the right, we have Fidel Herrera, who was governor of Veracruz. Both of them were in office around the same time, from 2004 to 2010. And both of these governors, during their tenure and after their tenure, after they stepped out of office, constantly made headlines being accused of corruption. The kinds of accusations that were leveled against them are not news. This is kind of like your run-of-the-mill accusations of corruption in Mexico. So basically, like buying, for example, medical equipment that then disappears magically and nobody knows where the money is. So, sort of like the traditional ways of corruption. There's nothing particularly egregious about the accusations leveled against them. And to be fair, in Mexico, accusations of corruptions are not uncommon. They were not uncommon then. They're not uncommon now. I don't think that in most sort of like modern history, they have been uncommon ever. But what's interesting about these two cases is that both of these governors took office at a time where Mexico was institutionally really well equipped to handle these accusations of corruptions, or at least so did the theory told us. So first, there was a great Freedom of Information Act that was implemented in 2003. They entered office in 2004. And this Information Act helped uncover corruption acts and acts of malfeasance that, give rise to like these types of headlines. But there was also political opposition and electoral competition. So for those of you who don't know, previous to 2000, Mexico was a single-party regime for for the good part of the 20th century. But post-2000, which is where these governors sort of like come to power, there's already a lot of political opposition. And so the literature would suggest, you have all of these politicians that want to enter office. So there's a lot of incentives for them to denounce and to like point out, who's the corrupt here in order to gain access to political office. So they were supposedly interested in denouncing these crimes. And then finally, Mexico also had an independent judiciary. So, again, the idea is that, okay, in theory, if those accusations pan out, there's going to be an investigation, charges will be filed, voila, you will get accountability. And we, in fact, do find that this is the case, of Reynoso Femat. So Reynoso Femat stepped down in 2010, and he has spent the good part of the past 15 years dealing with accusations, investigations, entering prison, exiting prison. So basically just coming in and out of a series of investigations and judicial processes. So he sort of like, very randomly sort of like pops up in my Google notifications. It's like, again, one of his, investigations is panning out. But this was not the case in Fidel Herrera's, this was not the outcome that we saw with Fidel Herrera. So Herrera's scandals remained that, scandals. After he finished his term, that again, he was accused of, like buying all these things and like pocketing the money and like being in cahoots with organized crime in Veracruz, which is now, if you don't know it, like one of the most violent states in Mexico. He spent some time, like after he left office, he spent some time in and out of other sort of like federal positions. And actually in 2015, he was even given what I think is one of the most coveted positions that the federal government has to offer, which is the Mexican consulate in Barcelona. And so he came to Barcelona, he spent here a little bit under 2 years, and he had to renounce because, you guessed it, corruption scandals. So he returned to Mexico after the short tenure that he had here in Barcelona, and he lives there, Sometimes he's like called to like give a statement or something regarding these accusations of corruption, but he has never, been arrested or charged with any crimes. And so this is these two cases, or sort of like these two different outcomes, highlight the motivation of the research that I'm going to present today. So the question that I'm going to seek to answer is why? Why is it that in the context of information about malfeasance, and in the sort of like in the presence of institutions that allegedly were supposed to foster accountability, do we see some politicians being prosecuted, but not others? So what basically explains this variation? And in other words, the question that I'm hoping to answer here today is what explains prosecution, but also what explains impunity of political elites? So after this brief introduction of the puzzle, that I seek to answer today, I'm going to begin by giving a brief review of the literature. I'm going to give a couple of existing answers to this question, and I'm going to talk about what I call kind of like an idealized narrative of prosecution in democratization. So sort of like thinking a little bit about how has the literature thought about prosecution in both in authoritarian and in democratic regimes, and what are their differences. And after that, I'm going to develop my argument, which, spoiler alert, I guess, I'm going to argue that prosecution is actually not as virtuous as we might think, and that we need to think like a little bit more fully about the institutions that actually are producing these political outcomes. And I am going to illustrate parts of my argument with evidence from the Mexican case and sort of like, the transition to democracy up until like more or less 2018. And then as a way of conclusion, I'm going to be talking about some implications of my argument for accountability, emphasizing particularly how prosecution can actually weaken democracies, prevent them from consolidating, and that probably we should be a little bit concerned about, the phenomena that we're seeing everywhere about backsliding democracy. So I'm going to this last part is going to be a little bit more of food for thought and like some of the things that I'm thinking currently about. So we start with the question, what explains prosecution or impunity? And existing literature has considered this question. And the answer that you get is going to depend on whether you're talking to scholars of authoritarian regimes or scholars of democratic regimes. So in these sort of two different strands of the literature that actually are kind of separate, but somehow they complement each other really well, we can see one sort of part of the literature saying, well, in authoritarian regimes, the autocrats control the judicial system. It's part of their, coercive apparatus. So they're going to prosecute corruption when it's convenient for them, when they want to sort of clean house or something. And in fact, when we think about corruption crackdowns, for example, in China, or when we think about cases such as Navalny, who was, imprisoned in Russia for embezzlement, we do actually think of oh, yes, this was definitely, there's definitely a very politicized aspect of this. And of course, there are some exceptions. And I can think, obviously, of Singapore, which is an authoritarian regime that nevertheless has used their judicial system to actually prosecute corruption. And it's sort of consistently one of the least corrupt countries in the world. But nevertheless, in general, the literature agrees that in an authoritarian regime, because the autocrat can control the judicial system, prosecution it's not going to respond to corruption. So there's going to be, high levels of corruption here and lower levels of prosecution that are basically explained by the whims of the regime. So this is what would explain prosecution or impunity in an authoritarian regime. Yeah, the vertical axis, sorry. The vertical axis here, it's just levels, and I'm sort of putting corruption and prosecution. This is an idealized graph. It's not actual data. So I'm just saying that if you are sort of in the literature on this side, on authoritarianism, you're going to expect to see high levels of corruption and low levels of prosecution because you don't need to prosecute corruption itself. Yes? Yes. So in the literature, both of these literatures are basically developed individually. So kind of separately, they actually don't talk much to each other. But you can think of these as, sort of as you transition to democracy. And let me just move to the next slide so that you can see it. So the idea here is that as you move towards democracy, you would see kind of a decrease in corruption and a slight increase in prosecution. So you can think of this as sort of a country moving from one end of the pole to the other. And so why is it that this is the case, that you can think of it this way? So in a democracy, these are the literature that talks about prosecution in democracy, the answer is actually quite different than the one that I just talked about. In a democracy, there are a series of institutions that I've already hinted at the beginning of this talk that are supposed to produce a virtuous cycle of accountability. So the most important one is elections and political competition. And again, this is said to structure the incentives of politicians so that politicians that are not in power can oversee those who are in power and basically sort of they're just waiting for those in power to grab them with a hand on the cookie jar. And then they can denounce them and be haha, I gotcha. And so then, your position is up for grabs, right? So then there's more competition. That is a very, very strong in the literature, that's a very strong argument for why is it that, democracy kind of produces this kind of good outcomes. And because in democracies, the judicial system is not at the beck and call of the leader, it's actually, kind of it's independent and whatnot. The judicial system is supposed to investigate and prosecute illegal actions if there's evidence for it. So contrary to in an authoritarian regime, in a democracy, the question of what explains prosecution is, well, if you see corruption and the corruption is public, right? And any case of impunity that you might see is usually chalked up to like, oh, this was kind of like a mistake. This is, like this thing was not working perfectly, but in general, it works this way. And of course, this kind of like idealized narrative, and again, I'm sort of like, summarizing a very, very big literature in a very short period of time. But I do think that this narrative was central to the way that political scientists and comparative politics scholars understood the democratization processes during the 1990s and 2000s. And during this time, and so sort of like called third wave of democratization, decreasing corruption was a main concern. And so the reason why I say this is because I think that this is what can explain these kinds of, so sort of like this existing literature is explained by what were scholars trying to explain in the first place. And they were actually trying to explain corruption levels. So if you recall, during this year, sort of like 1990s and 2000s, countries were not just transitioning to a democracy, but a lot of countries were also transitioning to a market economy, right? And so there was concern that there was a lot of corruption and that the transition to a market economy and to a democracy would help assuage, the sort of like corruption and all of this cronyism that you could see in authoritarian regimes in the 1980s and early 1990s. So these narratives interested in explaining levels of corruption, what they did was to say, okay, let's gather some empirical evidence. And so let's just basically gather levels of corruption for countries that are authoritarian here. And they found that they had, in general, high levels of corruption. And then let's just gather levels of corruption for democratic regimes. And they found that indeed they had, on average, lower levels of corruption than their authoritarian counterparts. So there was some empirical evidence to sustain that. Although I should say that probably recent literature has found that that gap is closing and that actually the, sort of like the regime types that were developed back then, authoritarianism and democracy, are not so pure. And so that actually, countries tend to like, be very similarly corrupt in levels. But back then, sort of like this is the literature that I'm building on. And so there was some evidence to propose that. Now you can see here that this literature is somewhat limited. And the reason for that limitation is because most of it has been developed to explain corruption levels, not prosecution. So basically, what that means is that a very important part of my argument is that part of what the literature is doing is that it's thinking of prosecution as a mechanism that explains other outcomes, but not as a political phenomena that should be studied in and of itself, sort of like as an important political phenomenon. It's always kind of like assumed to be sort of like, playing out. So you see these levels of corruption and you're like, oh, this is part of what must be happening. And so important to say that there are other reasons why we might explain the different levels of corruption. But regards to prosecution specifically, I think that the literature sometimes just assumes that that must be happening. And again, partly, this is a project where I'm trying to think of prosecution seriously as an outcome of interest, right? So not just as like part of a larger chain of events, but actually like, okay, when will we see it? And does this literature make sense to explain the occurrence of prosecution? So I built from this literature, from the literature that I just explained, but part of my argument is actually that prosecution or conceptualizing prosecution is not as different across these two regime types, authoritarianism and democracy. Particularly, part of my argument is that under very specific conditions, prosecution can operate very similarly in authoritarian regimes and in democracies. So specifically, I propose to conceptualize prosecution as a political tool that can be used to deal with political opponents. So please note that this is not a normative statement. So I'm not saying that this is good or that prosecutions are always unfair. That's not what I'm talking about here. Although I do think that this argument has some like implications as to like how do we think about prosecution in general. But what I'm doing by proposing this argument is saying what I would like to convince you is that thinking of prosecution as a political tool actually explains better the patterns that we observe in the real world, rather than to think like, oh, they're fundamentally different in democracies and in authoritarian regimes. So this conceptualization actually gives us a lot of leverage in explaining or in answering the question, which is, why is it that some politicians get prosecuted and not others? Now, why do I think that this is a good starting point? This is not quite super contested if I'm talking about authoritarian regimes. This is usually the starting point of an authoritarian regime. The criminal justice system is often part of the coercive apparatus that can be manipulated of those in power. But of course, I think that also in a democracy, this might also be the case. So it might also be useful to think about prosecution in this way when we're thinking about a democratic setting. Why? I particularly think that this is useful when prosecutors can act as agents of those in power. That is, existing literature has often considered that the first and most important political actor to think about politicized prosecutions are the courts. Everybody talked about judges and the courts. But actually, even before a case reaches the courts, a prosecutor has to make a case. They have to start an investigation. So there's the previous step that political scientists have not considered, which is precisely, okay, what's the role of the prosecutor here? And so right now, in many political systems, sort of like back then actually, but also right now, prosecutors are part of the executive branch, which means that they're often nominated and removed by the head of government. So if you have a prosecutor that you can hire and fire, you're much more likely to be able to say like, hey, don't waste your time investigating this person, investigate this other person. And so in that sense, it's actually very similar. Perhaps the consequences are not equally similar across regime types, but I do think that the dynamics are much more similar than what the literature would suggest. So when you can actually control your prosecutor, when the executive can control their prosecutor, it also means that prosecution is not a mechanism by which those outside of office oversee those who are in power, but it's actually the other way around. It's the president that says, okay, investigate this and investigate that, right? So in democracies, again, the executive might be able to investigate someone, even if they cannot tell the courts, hey, put that person in prison forever. They at least can direct investigations. And sort of like that first step, they do have a first mover advantage. So where does that leave us in order to answer the question? So part of the discussion that I have is that prosecution is a tool, but it's not the only tool that executives can use to deal with rivals. And particularly, I argue that it's not the most effective in either setting. That actually there's other things that executives can do to deal with political opponents. And particularly in authoritarian regimes, autocrats can just intimidate political opponents. That's kind of like, one of the most important marks of an authoritarian regime, which is they can actually like threaten you with physical violence. I'm just putting this very bluntly. Autocrats can send someone to your house to knock on your door and be like, hey, if you don't calm down, I'm going to make you disappear or something. And this might be more effective even than imprisonment, right? Because intimidation is usually secret. There's no backlash from the public. If you if you put a rival in jail, the citizens might be like, well, I think that this is a witch hunt or something. So you might want to keep it quiet. And intimidation is actually a much better way to do that. And an interesting conclusion or an interesting sort of like implication of this is that precisely in authoritarian places where we think that the leader can use prosecution as a tool to control rivals, autocrats don't have the need to use it as a tool because they have other tools that are better. So if an autocrat is truly that powerful, they're actually not going to need to wield the power. So even though they have the power to either intimidate you, and even if they control the prosecution and the courts and everything, they might not have to use it because the threat of use is enough to keep opponents at bay. So in this sense, yes, we might think of autocrats as having all the power, but that doesn't explain the occurrence of prosecution because we're not going to see it because they're going to be using it to do, sort of like, because they're going to use other tools to achieve the ends that they're sort of like set out to do. So let's see if this is actually the case, if this pans out. So sort of like, contrary to the literature that says like, oh no, yes, we see prosecution because people want to control opponents. I'm saying like, well, no, maybe we don't see that. And so I'm going to use the Mexican case to sort of like illustrate some of these dynamics. So one of the main empirical claims that I make is that under the PRI, intimidation was actually a key component of controlling political elites. So this is like pre-2000 during the single-party regime. So back then, the president, as many other authoritarian regimes, the president had an entire security apparatus to oversee and record dissidents. dissidents in general, sort of like, social dissidents, the social movements, but also political opponents specifically. So in particular, there were three kind of like big intelligence agencies, but particularly the GIPS and the DFS were, oh, sorry, I did not know that. Apologies. I've been like moving here, not there. Sorry. So particularly the DGIPS and the DFS were in charge of collecting this information. And during this time, the president could exert intimidatory tactics. So, for example, one of the things that I found in the archives is an anecdote of one of the directors of the DFS would like invite people to have coffee with him. And everybody knew that if he had like a manila envelope, and he was like, oh, I saw that you went, to this protest, and he would like grab a manila envelope and started playing with the that meant that there was information in that envelope to, like basically end you. So everybody was like, oh yeah, no, that was a mistake. I will not go to a protest again, right? And so these kinds of examples show, again, that intimidation is not just about, sending thugs, that oftentimes this intimidation is kind of like very veiled, but it's very effective, right? Like this is how he operated. He was so powerful that he did not need to actually use the police. He just needed to show a manila envelope. That's what he needed to do. So again, ironically, precisely because intimidation was so effective, they didn't need to use it. And, they kind of like did not use it as much as one would expect. But of course, they did not just rule by intimidation. Any autocrat that only rules by intimidation is going to be very unpopular. So it is true that also the president had the other tools, and particularly because the president back then was in charge of all the party bureaucracy and the federal administration and the government administration, actually at many levels of government, he could distribute patronage to reward loyalty. So arguably these can be, seen as rewards for, basically just keeping in line. So, this was kind of like a carrots and sticks approach rather than only sticks approach. And as a result, the use of courts as a way to control opposition was really rare because there was almost no need to. So let me show you here some data. So I should begin by saying intimidation is really, really difficult to observe. You cannot just go around and asking like, hey, were you intimidated? But we can actually start seeing some patterns that emerge, particularly if we compare it before the PRI, when the PRI was in office and after when they left. And we can see here sort of the distribution of all the governors in the 10 years before the PRI finished their 70-year rule. And basically what I want to show here is that 75% of the governors finished the term, and 13.4 stepped down after a scandal. So just to give you an example of what sorts of scandals, these are mostly corruption related. So one of the scandals is the governor of Jalisco basically had a corrupt scheme, or allegedly had a corrupt scheme, where there was some chemical waste being just sent to the sewage improperly. And that meant that the sewage in Guadalajara City, which is the second largest city in Mexico, exploded and actually killed a lot of people, right? And immediately the president was like, okay, you need to pay for this. You need to step down. And he stepped down. He was, he sort of continued his life without any other political position. So we can see here, so obviously this is not sort of pure evidence of intimidation, but given that the president had a lot of control over who was governor and who got to be a public servant, it's really hard to think that the president did not have a hand in requesting those kinds of step down after a scandal. And this is made even more evident if we see, okay, did this pattern continue after the PRI left? Because if these governors are just so virtuous that they know that they have to atone for their sins, then we should see this also happening post-democratization. And we in fact see that this is not at all the case. So from the 13.4% of governors that stepped down after a scandal, that number goes down to 2.6%. So only 3 governors. This, by the way, is only up until 2018. And I could talk about that in the Q&A. But basically, we have kind of like, a very sharp decrease in governors that are stepping down after a scandal. And it's important to say that during that time, the scandal did not decrease. Actually, they increased. There were more scandals of corruption being said, and way less governors resigning as well. So again, I think that this is suggestive evidence that the president did exert some pressure once governors were unpopular or a liability to their party. So this is how he chose to deal with opponents instead of putting them in prison, which I think he could have. And okay, so let's see, what about prosecutions? Because maybe they were also prosecuted. So in gathering data for this project, so the answer is no. So none of the governors that stepped down after a scandal were investigated for that scandal, none of them. And there were some governors that were investigated, but actually in the 10 years previous to the pre-demise, only seven of those governors were investigated. And of those 7, only 4 were investigated by the pre-president. They were all, 3 of them were investigated afterwards. So investigations or the use of judicial processes were actually not common during the pre. And again, if we think about what the, what the literature has said, they would have said like, if you have the control of the courts, maybe that's how you deal with opponents. And we see like, yeah, you do have control of the courts, but maybe that's not how you choose to do it. So basically 4 investigated governors versus the 11 that were asked to resign. Indeed, intimidation, or at least the threat of it, if you want to call it coerced convincing or something like that, that's fine. This seems to have been a much more used technique under the pre rather than jailing people to control the political landscape. So contrary to what is going on in authoritarian regimes, where the capacity to intimidate renders prosecution just less used because it's just not as effective, in democracies, executives cannot use intimidation to solve a political conflict. So part of the discussion that it's, I think, actually sort of like in the nerdiest sense, this is like, I think, my favorite discussion that I have. I'm not going to talk about it a lot here. But one of the things that I do think it's really important when thinking about the difference between an authoritarian regime and a democracy is to think not only how you get to power, so sort of like, traditional views of the difference between an authoritarian regime and a democracy is, did you get to power via elections or not? And what I say here is like, well, that's an important part, obviously, of what makes a democracy, but it's also how you use that power once you get there. And in this part, I'm saying like, well, a very important part of democracy is that if you are a democratic executive, you cannot use intimidation to go around solving political conflicts. Like a very basic central tenet of democracy is that if you have a political conflict, that is solved in the arms or in the appropriate institutional channels. You cannot just go around, hitting and threatening people. So because you cannot do that, then you might have to rely on the judicial system, which is legal and which, you have control of your prosecutor. So maybe that's how you wanna do it. So my argument is that in democratic regimes, we should observe more prosecution. So far, no surprises. That's also what the literature says, right? Like there should be more prosecutions. But what I think I contribute is that it's not only that you see more cases, is that also the cases that you see are like follow political lines, like they are politicized. So this is not just about seeing, how many cases are you prosecuting? It's also which cases are you prosecuting? Like what are you prioritizing in terms of investigation? And these should be politicized because they are being used as a way to weaken rivals, right? And this also kind of like has a little bit of like a methodological move on my part, which is previous studies have always thought about prosecution as like, how many people are you prosecuting? And I say like, no, you actually have to look at individual level instances of prosecution. It's not just a count, right? You don't like, it's not just about, did you increase or did you decrease? It's about, okay, how might you be shifting, the priorities in investigation? So do we see more prosecutions post transition, and do we see more politicized prosecutions in Mexico? So just, to illustrate these dynamics, in Mexico, democratization did mean that the president lost his ability to intimidate. So the institutions that I talked about, the DFS and the DGIPS, were dismantled. That was a very important part of the transition process, that you could no longer have this intelligence apparatus, like, gathering information on opponents. But democratization also brought more political competition, both obviously like across parties, like that was a central part of the democratization process, but also at different levels of government. So the president basically lost its almost absolute power, post 2000. And in particular, that power, or a lot of that power, was grabbed by the governors. So the governors became, in the post-transition era, quite powerful. Governors get a ton of money from the central government that they can spend almost unchecked, and they can command the bureaucratic structures of their state. So they can staff them, which means they have a ton of patronage. And, they were even called the new virreyes, the new viceroys, right? So this is like this is how powerful they became. And with everything that they can control, sort of like post democratizations, governors in office were at the top of the political hierarchy, but that was kind of like a double-edged sword, because governors have no right to re-elect consecutively. So they could not be re-elected. So it's not just that, you became a governor and then you were powerful and you can, sort of like continue to be powerful in that position, 6 years and you're out. And so what happened is that there were these dynamics that occurred that were sort of like, documented largely by Joy Langston, where because you have to step out after 6 years in office, then basically what you do as a governor is use those 6 years to amass a ton of resources that then you can use to leverage your political future. So just to give you an example of these kinds of amassing of resources, for example, they would control patronage networks or vote clientelistic networks. And then they would call their party and they'd be like, okay, I can deliver you this amount of votes. Please put me in the list for Senate for next, like once I'm out of the governorship. And so that's how they were using the power that they had to secure their future. But of course, this meant that there might be a conflict, because the incoming governor was like, wait, why do you get to control those votes? I want to control those votes, right? And what happened is that at the moment of when one governor leaves and the other governor comes out, there's a lot of potential for conflict, because the outgoing governor is like, no, these are my friends. And the incoming governor is like, no, I want them to be my friends. And so there's the potential for these kinds of conflicts. And the outgoing governor no longer enjoys immunity for prosecution. So while you're governor, you cannot be prosecuted. But when you leave, you're very, very vulnerable. So my argument is that, okay, if there are political rivals at that particular moment, do we see more prosecution of outgoing governors by incoming governors? And do we see that these prosecutions are more politicized, right? And again, this is not just like, they're just going to prosecute everyone. It could be that there's no conflict because you're from the same party. So you're like, yeah, sure. I'll give you these votes and just, let me sort of like rule my state in peace. So in this sense, I do expect prosecutions to be much more frequent across partisan lines. And in this way, they will be more politicized. So they will not respond to corruption itself, but they will respond to, is the incoming governor from a different party than you or not. And so I'm going to show you some models, I promise, but let me continue a little bit with the descriptive statistics to show that indeed democratization brought about more prosecution in this way. So in here, I'm showing state level investigation. So I'm so sorry. So in here, I am showing you the prosecution in Mexico. This is only post 2000. So I'm not sure, just so you know, pre 2000, there are no state-level investigations of governors, so there's nothing to show. But post-2000, you can start seeing how governors start prosecuting their state investigations. There's 9 here. I'm sorry, I was thinking about federal. We have 9, so 11% of governors being prosecuted, and post-2000, we have 30, so almost like 2.5%, almost 2.5 times more. So state investigations increase considerably, and actually investigations are more frequent across party lines. So this table looks at prosecutions only after 2000, and we can see indeed that incoming governors investigate outgoing governors twice as often when they come from a different party. So the partisan bias is quite clear and evident. So we do see that very clearly here. Now, Of course, the question is like, okay, but what about corruption? Maybe if you're from a different party, you're just much more corrupt, right? So maybe the idealized narrative of democratization is working and you're just, not looking at it the right way. So I do have, I'm going to get a bit technical, but I try to keep the technicalities of this to the minimum. So I have a series of what I think are really nice multi-level models. I'm just going to present one. But in these models, I basically explore whether these patterns hold after a set of covariates. And all of these are the covariates, but just to sort of give you a sense of what I'm showing here, this is a logistic model. So basically the outcome that I am modeling is the probability of being prosecuted. That's it. And I'm saying, okay, the probability of being prosecuted might depend on judicial control. So basically, do you control judges? Does the incoming governor participate in the nomination of judges? That's what this is measuring. Is the outgoing governor and the incoming governor from the same party? So are they co-partisan? The competitiveness, so how strong were you electorally when you arrived to office? And then this is kind of the most important, the corruption scandal, right? So were you accused of corruption? Because maybe if you were not accused of corruption, they shouldn't prosecute you. And so that's that, right? This is a measure, a newspaper-based measure that I can talk about more if you'd like. And then I have a couple of others that are there for decreasing bias. And so the outcome, as I've said, is the probability of investigation. And because this is a logistic model, if this is the line of 1, and so if any of the estimates cross that lines, it means that we cannot say that the probability of observing investigation is just as likely when you move the independent variable, right? So basically, if it's just as likely, there is no effect. It doesn't explain that. And we can see here that governors are indeed less likely to prosecute their co-partisans. And that effect is quite big. They're 75% less likely to observe prosecution. And most importantly, corruption scandals don't seem to have any effect at all. Just on that, this is, as I've said, it's a newspaper-based measure. I tried first going for, okay, were there any denounces, actually people going to the prosecutorial office and being like, look, this governor did this and stole this. And so I started compiling that data, actually finished compiling the data, and every single governor is 185 governors total. Only 5 of them had not been publicly denounced. So there's no variation there. There's truly no variation that explains why are some prosecuted and why are some not. Perfect. So let me just conclude by discussing a couple of ways in which my explanation, or sort of everything that I've told you here, actually answers the question that I set out to answer. So I began this presentation by asking, okay, what explains persecution or impunity of political elites? Of political elites. And I said, okay, let's not think about prosecution as this awful thing that happens in democracies and these virtuous things that happen in authoritarian regimes. If we think of prosecution as a tool to control opposition, we're actually better able to explain the patterns, not only of the frequency of prosecution, but also who gets prosecuted and under which conditions. And of course, it's important to note that my question, that my answer holds because prosecutors are dependent on the executive. So if we had a country where the prosecutor is really independent and really well motivated and a great bureaucrat that only wants to see justice, maybe this explanation would not explain that particular case. But overall, intimidation seems to be a much more efficient tool, and we can see that in the data. It does seem to have been used more in any case than prosecution. And so as a consequence, in democracies, prosecutions are more common, but they're also more likely to be partisan in nature, which is not what, the idealized narrative would have suggested. And as a way of concluding, let me talk about 3 different ways in which, this particular research has made me think about, okay, where does that leave us in terms of democratic consolidation, which, it's a thing that I think comparative politics people are really scared about right now. That is not happening. Democracies are not consolidating. So how might this particular project explain that? So first, the deterrent effect of prosecution, so this idea that if you punish corruption, then people are going to do it less, doesn't seem to be working, right? Because A, the probability of being apprehended is completely orthogonal or unrelated to corruption, even when that corruption is public, and even when newspapers continue to publish, like time and time and time again, and even when NGOs are publicly denouncing these kinds of malfeasance. And then second, I don't talk about this here. That's kind of like part of the larger project, but actually the cost of being apprehended is not super high. Of all of those governors that were apprehended, only a handful ended up in actual prison. So they were all investigated. They were probably all like subject to trial and whatnot, but only a few of them ended up in prison. And actually 2 of them ended up in prison in the US. So they were extradited. So the Mexican justice system wasn't even able to hold them accountable. So this is concerning because effectively the public goods and public office are being captured by private interests, and that is not good for democracy. And of course, citizens know this, right? So another consequence of these types of partisan patterns of prosecution is that trust, both in the criminal justice system, but also in the democratic system overall, is eroded. Citizens become cynical, not only if politicians are not prosecuted, which obviously, if you see someone that's insanely corrupt and is not prosecuted, you might be like, well, of course, this doesn't work. But I have also found evidence that even when a politician is corrupt and they get prosecuted, citizens are like, well, yes, they're being prosecuted, but it's not because they're corrupt. It's because they made someone angry. And so you kind of you do kind of have, you do kind of observe these kinds of explanations that the citizens have, even in the presence of something that should be considered accountability, right? And so I think that is also a very important consequence that we should look at. And then finally, this is something that I've just very recently started to think about. So if anyone is, if anyone has any ideas on how to truly sort of theorize this, I think that a consequence of this is that anti-corruption discourses can be used by populist politicians. Obviously, because Mexico is the case that I know the most, I think that this clearly happened with the last president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who came to power in 2018. And a crucial part of his discourse was not only we need to eradicate corruption, which I think is very common across politicians, but also that one way to that corruption was not going to be eradicated by following the rule of law, because the rule of law was captured by these interests, right? And when you see the data, you're like, okay, I don't want to buy that specific explanation, but it doesn't seem far-fetched that yes, you are seeing that some people that should be in prison are not in prison, and so of course these, it sort of gives credence to these anti-corruption discourses. And of course, sort of finally, just to wrap up, I think that as a discipline, this might not sort of resonate to everyone here, but I think that as comparative politics scholars, we should just really take more seriously the role of prosecutors. It has been completely forgotten from thinking about how the criminal justice system can be deployed. And it just, I really do think that we need to take them more seriously, and the role that they play precisely in strengthening institutions that, are supposed to deliver good quality democratic accountability. So thank you so much. I think that those are 46 minutes, so I think I'm good. But thank you so much, and I really look forward to any questions and answers. I mean, I'm actually...
Thank you, Milena, so much. We have plenty of time till 1:30. Please don't leave, because we have a very nice Christmas reception, I guess, with food included. We've developed a system for questions that seems to work quite well. We'll allow 2 questions to be posed, and then Milena will answer 2 questions at a time. And I think it's very nice to let the host ask the first question if he has one, because, he makes the effort to. Do you have a question, Toni, for Milena? Do you want to first question?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. Sorry, I wasn't expecting that.
Side with you.
No, don't, no problem. I guess my first reaction is that if I go to a meeting again and there is an envelope on the table, I should run away. No? But Yeah, no, on a more serious note, I guess I've got like, it's not a question, it's more of a doubt about prosecution itself, which is obviously a key term in your presentation and your future paper. So what is it really, prosecution? No, I'm kind of missing a little bit of definition in there, because like I can think of many different things. So one could think of like the system having private information and then using this private information to sort of signal something that the judiciary wants to achieve, either from an economic point of view, political point of view, any point of view, really. Are we talking about selective repression? So, you'll have all the resources to target everyone. So you target the leaders, the most important people, or is there any type of randomness in prosecution? Like if you don't have the private information, you might want to, start repressing here and there, as we know very well in our context. And then, like, do they do it because they have intrinsic preferences to sort of like influence the government in a certain way? Or I don't know. There's a lot of like doubts that I have about the type of prosecution that they can engage in. And I guess like also suggestion for you, maybe one of the things that you could also do, if that's possible in Mexico, you can do like this, try to run these models that they do in the US to estimate the position of judges. And then see like one of these topic models, so IRT, whatever, or however they are called, and then calculate the distance between the ideal point of the governor, so who is in government in there, and that would be another measure of co-partisanship. But from a judicial point of view, that could sort of help you in trying to capture something else different than what you're doing. Yeah, but these are my thoughts so far.
Thank you.
Do you want to answer, Milena, or should we open the...
I think...
two more questions. Sorry, I forgot about that. Yeah.
Can you hear? Yeah. Hi, Milena. Thank you so much for this presentation. I don't think we met. My name is... No, it doesn't work?
Now.
Okay. I don't like having it so close. Okay. My name is Eva, and thank you. I found this super interesting. And my question is, because you mentioned many times, I know some about the system in Mexico, but not to the detail that you do. You mentioned many times that the prosecutor is kind of under the executive, is under the commands of the executive. And I'm wondering if, and maybe this would be an expansion, but if you would find similar results in places. So in the United States, sometimes the prosecutor is under the command of the executive, and sometimes the prosecutor is elected. And the same thing with the judiciary. And I remember Mexico just recently had a judicial overhaul that a lot of people say is very corrupt. And other people say, well, it's making it like the American system, which may or may not be very corrupt. But I'm wondering if that also has some influence. If judges can be elected directly, will that influence prosecute? Like, how does that go into your theory here? Thank you.
I guess you can answer now. No? Another one? Oh, but that's three.
Yeah. No. So I cannot. Yeah. Thank you. So I'm gonna try to answer this as briefly as possible. But of course, when the first question is like, wait, what are you talking about? It's kind of like, okay, I should have had a definition. But basically, by prosecution, I very specifically mean kind of a criminal justice process that is opened against a specific person for a specific action, right? It was sort of like, and it begins at the moment where either you have like a person comes in and denounces someone, una denuncia, or it can also begin by sort of like motu proprio of the prosecutors themselves that say like, hey, there's something weird going on there. And so a prosecution starts there. So the investigation is kind of like part of that. And then if enough evidence is collected, then you take it to a judge. And the judge, depending on the system, right, the judge can either order more inquiry, like further investigation, which was partly the case in Mexico in some of the years that I'm talking about here, or the judge can say, look, this is just not enough, and that. But I think that actually kind of like your question was, what is prosecution? But also like, is this selective repression? And so in a very, I'm being recorded, so I have to be very careful of what I say. But I do think that in sort of like in a very theoretically uninteresting way, but in a normatively important way, all criminal justice is selective repression, right? Like that's what they're doing is just legitimized, and but I do think that what I'm talking about here is selective repression, of political elites. And weirdly enough, what I'm saying is that in democracy, this selective repression also happens, but the consequences are not as awful, right? Because if you truly are innocent, if everything gets sorted out and the judges do actually, work more or less fine, you shouldn't suffer the consequences of forever being in jail just because, you managed to make someone angry. I'm going to sort of skip and just sort of talk about estimating the position of judges. Yes, there's actually a couple of projects that I know that do exactly this in Mexico. I'm actually thinking about doing something like this, but estimating the ideological position of prosecutors themselves. So I do have some data on, for example, the careers of prosecutors. So largely, one of the things that I've had the most pushback with this project is, okay, how do you know that the prosecutors are actually at the beck and call of the executive, right? Yes, they can nominate them and they can fire them, but maybe they are good prosecutors. Could that be a thing? And so the data that I'm gathering is okay, is there an advantage to enacting some of these politically costly prosecutions, right? So is it the case that prosecutors that actually embark on this, like the case I was talking about, Reynoso Femed, truly, it's been 15 years and this guy is in and out of prison when other people are just in their apartments in Dubai, being happy. So it is kind of is there an advantage of on a prosecutor undertaking a case like this? What I'm finding now at the federal level is that actually prosecutors at the federal level that undertook these kind of really politically costly cases do end up in better positions once they're done with the procuracy. So once they leave office. So I'm thinking that maybe there's something around that, but I would love to get something about sort of ideal position or the closeness of prosecutors to judges, but also to the executives themselves. And now, what if the prosecutor was selected? So actually, so one of the reasons why I end my analysis in 2018 is because there was an overhaul also of the Fiscalías and the prosecutorial office in Mexico. So now prosecutors are independent, so they cannot be hired and fired by the governor just like that. So in some instances, they are nominated by the Senate. There's a whole series of checks and balances, and then they get to be in position for, say, 10 years. So you cannot fire them, right? And so what how might that change? So I think that partly from the cases that I know where prosecutors are, for example, and I'm thinking specifically, I'll talk about the US case in a sec, but the Indonesian Corruption Prosecution Commission, which is, they have a really good, they had a really good track of actually punishing corruption. So you can actually design, and they were very independent. So you can actually design, I think, an institution that does not depend on the whims of the executive. It might have slightly different problems, but it's not going to have this particular partisan prosecution problem. And to the case of the United States specifically, there has actually been research specifically on, the prosecutors that are elected act differently in terms of partisan prosecutions, and yes, they do, but it's actually in the opposite way where you would expect, because if you are elected, you're running on a party platform, so you're going to be prosecuting the people on the other end. So actually, yes, so they do have to sort of have some results in terms of, you're actually prosecuting corruption and you're winning these cases. That is the incentive that you have when you are subject to election, but it does not completely eliminate the problem with, of partisan bias.
Thank you, Milena. Thank you for this beautiful presentation. I really like this idea of all prosecutions being selective in nature. I was thinking about two variables that maybe you already tried to run the models using them, but I was wondering your thoughts on that. A first variable would be the types of corruption or kinds of corruption. You conceptualize a lot prosecution, but you did not talk that much on corruption. And we know that perhaps one thing is building yourself a countryside house or a palace or whatever, or buying a Ferrari. And another thing is paying for your party or getting money for your party being funded and things like that. that could be more political in nature, more in the advantage of your own party. And then the other question is on the biography or biography or the informal ties that these governors have with prosecutors and judges. Do you have data on their families, on where they socialized, where they grow up, where did they study, if they know the judges, if they know the prosecutors, if they are family members or relatives? That could also explain this variability in a more informal way. But given what we know about Spain, very plausible in the end.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Milena. I have a very brief question about something that wasn't very clear to me. Basically, I wonder what the implications of this is for democratically backsliding countries. You brought them up toward the end, but I wasn't sure if I followed what your predictions were for them. So would you predict that there will be more frequent use of persecution or more of this politically charged episodes of persecution against rivals? Or would you say that in democratically backsliding countries, the executive already begins to have some other tools to intimidate, so they don't have to then rely as much on the prosecutor's office? Yep. Oh yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I answer, right? Yes. Thank you. Thank you. So let me just take this in order. So the type of corruption, this is a crucial question. So empirically, most of the governors are just accused of things like embezzlement, illicit enrichment, buying a castle in Switzerland, things like that. There is a lot on the literature about party corruption. To be honest, I have not gathered data on whether the charges are related to them sending that money to the parties. But I do think that the variation in types of corruptions that is really interesting, particularly in the context of Mexico right now, is corruption as in, you sort of fake a sale of medical equipment and then pocket the money. Or are you colluding with organized crime? And the reason why that's important is because, obviously because organized crime is a big deal in Mexico, but more to the point, collusion with organized crime is always investigated at the federal level, and actually the federal government has to investigate any. So this idea that you can say no, don't investigate that. You cannot do if it's collusion with the organized crime. The federal agency has to investigate it. I don't know if they really investigated or they, are just oh yeah, I don't see anything happening and that's it. But they cannot just say which in other kinds of things, they can be oh, you told me that he had faked these receipts, but actually I don't think that that's true and I'm not going to investigate. So that I think is one of the crucial differences. So I will look into that a little bit more, particularly at the federal level. As for the informal ties, so no, I don't have it. And I actually hadn't thought about judges specifically and think about this. I had thought about prosecutors, and I do have a data that I haven't reached the analysis of that part, but I do have data on the stories of the prosecutors, because most presidents in Mexico, especially pre-2000, were lawyers, and prosecutors have to be trained as lawyers as well. So it would be interesting to know if there's a little bit of getting to know, even if it's not, oh, you grew up with them, maybe you met them in college and then you both went together to the pre-party parties, I guess. So maybe that's why. So I'll definitely check that out. And I hadn't thought about judges, but I should also look at it. So what are the implications for democratic backsliding, and specifically, do I expect to see, let me just go back a little bit, do I expect to see this happening more? So I think that in particular, the biggest implication for democratic backsliding is precisely that you're not going to be able to build a robust opposition if all they have to be concerned about is, I just hope that I don't get investigated for corruption, right? And so that basically prevents opposition to thrive, to maybe get office, reach into office. And one of the characteristics, I think, of this sort of democracies that start backsliding is that precisely the person in power has nominally democratic institutions, but that are being manipulated for their interest. And I think that this is exactly what this story is. It's like, okay, you have a nominally democratic institution, which is prosecution, that is supposed to be good and supposed to deliver accountability, but it's not doing that. So on the one hand, I think that is the case. And do they have already other tools? I do think that, simultaneously, as they are kind of, manipulating this and sort of like initiating strategic strategic prosecutions, they are also developing other tools, for example, like loading the courts, right? Like that's a big thing. These, like, I don't want to get too much into the judicial reform that was mentioned before in Mexico, but I do think that part of it is, the current party, Morena, the one that won the presidency in 2018, that just won again, they have just such a large electoral support that if I were them and I were, very strategic, I would also want to have judges elected right now, because right now I know that I can pack the courts electorally. So using nominally, democratic institutions, not saying that this is happening because I'm being recorded, but I'm just saying if I were, then maybe that wouldn't be such a bad strategy. So I do think that this particular strategy is not kind of like just getting developed by itself. It's also operating along with other non-democratic mechanisms.
Hola, Milena. Thanks for the fascinating presentation, which made me think a lot. And I'll try to be brief, but I'll be quick as usual. I was thinking your presentation made me think a lot on the strategic considerations of this targeted sort of repression, right, and the political use of prosecution, right. And in the case of autocracy, you see the point of not having to use it so much, especially maybe when you're dealing with opposition leaders, maybe when you're dealing with elites, and you're trying to signal that you have this capacity to get rid of them beyond using purges. You may be using these more judicial mechanisms just to damage the prospects of an outside option from the regime. But it's kind of a different. Which then when we move back again to the realm of democracies, thinking what's the expected benefit of using this targeted prosecution, especially considering the case where you said that governors cannot be re-elected, right? So then what is it the expected benefit of trying to damage an outgoing governor from the perspective of an incoming governor, meaning, if the benefit is just damaging the career prospects of an outgoing governor, maybe in trying to improve the explanatory power of your model, beyond going whether they're from the same party or not, but there are some elements, individual level elements of those outgoing governors that make them more likely to be targeted by those prosecutions because they represent more of a threat. So I would like to know, why is it that an outgoing governor can represent a sort of a threat that you have an incentive to target him mostly, right? I guess with this sort of prosecution, or whether it's kind of also trying to use the logic of authoritarian repression, or whether it's the incoming governor that has a strong incentive to do that prosecution, not only to damage these prospect careers of the party to which the governor belongs, but to increase the prospects of a future career by signaling capacity, honesty, or whatever that is. And then it would be kind of more the individual level characteristics of the incoming governor that make him explain why they would have a stronger incentive to prosecute some people or not, or this cross-state sort of variation in the likelihood of observing prosecution. So I think that the part that they try to damage these career prospects, whether they happen at the individual level because that outgoing governor represents something of a threat or whatever, or it's just the party brand that they're trying to affect in the long term. So I would think that we need a little more clarification on the expected benefits of using that prosecution. And related to that, and sorry for taking a little too long, is, does it have consequences? So the fact that you have been prosecuted, even if it doesn't, end up in a sentence and you being jailed or whatever, or having to pay a fine, does it matter, right? Because in terms of the expected benefits, it has to matter whether I'm just using this target prosecution as a political tool in ruining careers and affecting potential electoral outcomes in the upcoming elections and so on and so forth. So, thanks, Milena.
Hi, Milena. Thank you for the presentation. At times, I was losing track if we were discussing Mexico or Pakistan because there's a lot of commonality there. Just for the sake of clarity, this research was not limited to the two states you started with, but the pre and post 2000 is across the Federal Republic. Yes? So do you notice a pattern if these corruption scandals came out of some particular states, recurring, or was it more common across the 31 states in the Federal Republic? Secondly, a point on the anti-corruption discourses used by populist politicians. I'll give an example from Pakistan. So the ex-prime minister is currently in jail and he came to power on, well, the anti-corruption populist discourse. Now he's in jail for over a year. He's had the use of selective repression against him, 300 plus cases across the federation filed against him. They took him out of office, put him in jail, to the point where they amended the constitution and tampered with the judicial system and the appointment of the chief justice. So he doesn't come with the seniority now. He's elected by the executive, just so they could keep this guy in jail. So the question is, to what extent, on this point, to what extent the corrupt status quo can go to counter these populist discourses? And do you think it's not just then limited to the individual levels, but maybe rather an overarching power, such as that military establishment in Pakistan? So I'm not sure if that's going to explore.
Sorry, can you repeat the question? So like, if it's not just about the individual governors themselves,
Yes,
like what do they do? But
this overarching entity, for example, what we call as the establishment in Pakistan, which is not a person, but it is an entity that basically controls all institutions.
okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so let me begin with sort of like Abel's question of like, okay, what is the expected benefit? So I'm actually going to go back to the couple of examples that I began with, because I think that they will illustrate really well what were the expected benefits, not only of prosecuting, but also of not prosecuting, because there's also benefits to not prosecuting. So what happened in the case of Reynosa Femat, and obviously this is, again, these are the kinds of political phenomena that I think are so incredibly interesting, but you can't just like go and ask Reynosa Femat, like, hey, were you politically prosecuted? Because obviously he's going to say yes, right? And like he has no motivation to say no. But basically what happened with Reynosa Femat is that he came to power as a PAN governor, and then as he was finishing his term, he wanted his friends to be the candidate for the PAN governorship in the, as he was outgoing. And the PAN was like, no, I don't think so. I'm going to put this other person. And he was like, okay, fine. Then I'm going to support the PRI candidate. And so he sort of like switched, at the end, he sort of like gave his support to someone else. And the PAN candidate won, which is, not great if you're supporting the other guy that's also not in your party. And so basically the benefit there, I think, was to sort of like show that you should actually just keep in line and that you shouldn't be, doing this. And again, this is the guy that has spent 15 years in and out of prison, where like a lot of really, really corrupt governors have not seen the inside of a cell ever. So you're trying to damage basically an outgoing governor precisely because you think that by doing so, like by investigating them, and then if you can like actually make the charges stick, if you will, you might actually just weaken the electoral support that they have. Like their support of other candidates no longer holds that much sway. So I think that that's one way in which they can be damaged. But also, I think that sort of like the counterpart is that there are incentives to collusion. And so in here, I think that the Fidel Herrera case is actually a pretty good example. So one of the things that Herrera was accused of, as I showed, was of buying medical equipment without, and then just, he would be like, oh, actually, he was very specifically accused. One of the many accusations was that he had bought a bunch of medicines and that he had actually that those medicines were fake, and so that he had given fake medicines in public hospitals, right? And he had basically pocketed the money and just like injected like saline solution to kids. So this is a really bad charge, right? Like this is not great. The subsequent governor of Veracruz after Fidel Herrera was Javier Duarte, who actually used very similar tactics, and Javier Duarte did actually end up in prison for those charges. So in that particular sense, Duarte did not have any interest because colluding with him meant like, oh, I might be able to use like a similar scheme to like, pocket money. So I also think that there's kind of like that benefit. Do they increase, do incoming governors increase their prospects by being like, oh, I'm so good because I'm prosecuting the previous governor? I think that in most of the cases that I can read, all governors that are investigating an outgoing governor use this language. They say like, look, like I'm so good and I am actually I want to clean house. I think that this is because talk is cheap, right? They cannot come out and say like, well, I'm really doing this because I don't like that guy. So they actually do say like, oh, I'm like very pure and I really like anti-corruption. I don't think that a lot of voters believe that. Like, I think that it's pretty transparent to voters that this is just talk. And does it have consequences? So it does ruin careers. Investigations by themselves do not, but if you are actually called to testify, you might just not hold, a position again. So in the case of Fidel Herrera, for example, like after all this time that he was accused of corruption, finally he had to leave Barcelona, and he's not, he has tried to come back to the political arena, but he's not supported by a lot of people, and so he's just, in his house. I mean, at ease and not being investigated, but it does. I do think that it can ruin political careers. And if you have a political career that is ruined, then maybe whatever resources that you had while you were a very powerful governor are now up for grabs, right? So maybe that's the thing. Okay, so are these corruption scandals concentrated in one state? There are some states that you can see more corruption scandals, yes. So Veracruz is definitely one. So Fidel Herrera's state is definitely one that you can see, just like on Morelos is another one that you just see like one another. There's some, for example, Mexico City, it's not. There are corruption scandals, but not at the level that you would see in other places. For that, in the models, I do have fixed effects for states, so that is considered in the models. But you do see kind of like geographies of corruption very, very clearly. So, and sort of like the last question. So, can this be kind of like the establishment being controlling? And I think that actually this relates to Umut's question, right? So, like, is this something that is not just an incoming and an outgoing governor? Like, could this be something like much more generalized and sort of like built into the system? And I think that it can definitely, that it can absolutely. And the danger here is precisely to think that just because a politician is corrupt and they were prosecuted, that somehow brings about accountability. I think that is kind of like a good step. I'm not saying like, oh, they don't deserve it. Like, yes, maybe they should be investigated. But if we want to talk about accountability, we also need to look at overall patterns. People notice when you're only prosecuting your opponents, and that erodes democracy in the long run and enables precisely the establishment of these sort of like, selective prosecutorial practices. So I think that we should sort of like, just be very aware that just because someone is corrupt and they are being prosecuted doesn't mean that like this is a victory for democracy. It can be in some sense, but in other senses, it might not be. We have to see like, what's happening overall in a polity.
Oh my God. Yeah. I more questions. You have a lot of really leader stuff.
So thanks, Milena. Thanks, Milena, for the presentation. It was very interesting, and I have like different thoughts that maybe they are not very organized because just, but the graph you showed at the beginning of how corruption decreases and persecution slightly increases when we go from autocracy to democracy.
Yeah.
The question here is, is the same story for all democracies, no matter if they were been democracies for all their life, like say the US or countries that democratize after an autocratic period.
Yeah.
And in this sense, what about those countries that were authoritarian and they transitioned to democracy, but some institutions, autocratic institutions, remain in place, even changing the name? I'm thinking of Spain and how the current Audiencia Nacional was a former, court that was used for prosecuting political crimes, let's say it this way. And in this sense, if in democracies intimidation is not useful. It's not a tool that should be used because, we are in a democracy and so on. Might persecution be understood also as intimidation? So you persecute to intimidate because you cannot intimidate. Even if this person has not committed a crime, you persecute it. You persecute this person to intimidate this person. You know what I mean? Yes. So in the sense, also, we cannot know if there's been intimidation because it's not public. And as you said, you cannot go and ask, have you been intimidated?
Yeah.
But, maybe persecution, how many of these people that were persecuted were convicted at the end?
Yeah.
So maybe just a tool for democracies and especially post-authoritarian countries that they can use intimidation. So these all ways of living and the political life change to a persecution, and that, as you said, it's a selective repression tool, right? So so I think that's all.
Question. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Milena, for wonderful presentation. Very interesting. I'm not an expert on the topic, but your talk evokes a lot of thoughts, especially coming from Latin America as well. So my first question, I have 2 comments. First of all, the question related to, your title, where you include the word accountability. And I was wondering to what extent, accountability is present in your theoretical framework and how you operationalize it, because I couldn't grasp it from your presentation. You in your final slide, you mentioned trust, and accountability tools can be used for window dressing, basically. Yeah. So I don't know if in this case persecution, is connected to accountability in that regard. And my second comment, and this is also maybe from my own ignorance, is related to the use of democratic backsliding. And also myself coming from Colombia, I was thinking, we officially, we don't have a democratic backsliding per se, or a process that could be defined as such. But I can see a lot of the elements that you were commenting being present for many, many decades in our judicial system. So I was wondering, what is the usefulness of democratic backsliding for contextualizing or to put it context to what you want to explain? Thank you so much for wonderful presentation.
And we have to learn the mod.
Excellent. I will be super brief. Okay. Your question, I think, sort of hit the nail in the head. I think that prosecution is actually, it's just legal intimidation, right? And I think that to an extent we have accepted as society, or at least, we should sort of acknowledge that part of the criminal justice system does this legally and that we're okay with it, right? In some instances, maybe not in others. But I do think that it is definitely legal intimidation. And actually in my, these systems for my doctoral project, and in my project, I actually call it extra legal and legal intimidation. That's how I refer to them. Now, what happens if autocratic institutions remain in place? I actually think that this is something that I think to put a little bit more explicitly in the paper and in the presentation. But basically, I think that that's exactly what happened in Mexico. So you sort of had all of these so-called democratic reforms in Mexico, where you had, again, transparency, you had better subnational competition and all of these things. But one thing that was not reformed, if the judicial system was reformed, but one thing that was not reformed was the prosecutorial office. And actually the prosecutorial offices in a lot of transitioning countries was not reformed. And it just sort of remained there as kind of this remnant. And I think that has had incredible consequences as to whether countries have actually been able to achieve a legal or to achieve a place where rule of law actually exists. And I think that that's absolutely the case. I do have, sort of shameless self-promotion. I do have actually a paper that talks specifically about the consequences of not addressing these kinds of institutions that basically gather intelligence, investigate, and then use, the criminal justice system. What happens if you don't address them? And turns out that after 20 or 25 years, the quality of democracy is terrible. The countries that actually did something to address those sort of like early on in the democratization process were able to basically build political parties that are much more responsive to their constituents. So I think that you're absolutely right on this, and I'm fascinated by this sort of like legacies of authoritarianism, I guess. Okay, accountability. What is it? So I think that I will say this. I don't think that these prosecutions are window dressing. I think that they are doing a very important political work. So it's not just that they're there, you know, for the shows. I think that they're doing important political work. It might not be the political work that we want them to do. But sort of like I conceive of accountability not just as like the individual instance of justice being done, but the general sense that justice is in general being done. And I think that that's where these politicized prosecutions fail to meet the standard, right, of accountability. And this is why people are like, well, yeah, and this person might be corrupt, but also, you know, like what's going on. And so, you know, how do we know it? Like there might be some of these elements in other countries, but there might not be properly backsliding. I don't think it's right. I mean, I think that sort of like this particular project is very much rooted in my concern about, and my interest obviously, but like mostly my concern about Mexico. That's sort of like, you know, in 2000. So I basically came of age as the country was like, you know, transitioning to democracy, and everybody was like, oh my God, you're studying political science at the best moment because we now have all of these great things. And then it's been like, oh no, it's been like, you know, a 24-year-long meme of just like, oh my God, this is terrible. So I think that because of that, I'm sort of like very interested also to take this and trying to explain what I see as, you know, a part of concern for democratic backsliding that's happening right now. But I would say that you can still have these kinds of elements and not have, you know, terrible consequences. And I do think that we should. So it's not just all bad. Maybe we should end on that note. It's not just all bad. We can do maybe some nice things with accountability, but we have to pay attention to the institutions themselves.
Wonderful.
Thank you.